Meiri. Evidently, my name is Finkelstein and I'm an archaeologist. And I'm here for two reasons. First of all, to give a short introduction to a presentation and to a study which was archaeology aimed, or historically aimed, so to speak. And secondly, to advocate cooperation between molecular biologists and bioinformatics researchers and archaeologists. I think that there is a great advantage, big advantage in this line of research. So we are speaking about ancient DNA of peaks and mobility between the Aegean and the Levant in the late second millennium BC. And the question is the nature of this mobility, because we know about this from archaeology. We know that there are commodities that were shipped from the Aegean basin to the Levant in the late Bronze Age. There is evidence for mobility of people in the Iron One, and there is also evidence for the other way around, which means commodities that were sent, vessels, ceramics, which is found in Greece, testifying to connections between the Levant and the Aegean in the late Bronze Age. The best manifestation of this connection possibly is the shipwreck that was excavated off the shores of southern Turkey several decades ago at a place called Uluburun. The ship sunk around 1300 BC, a little bit before possibly, and the cargo of the ship demonstrates beautifully the different commodities that were passed from the Aegean to the Levant and back. A connection between the Aegean and the Levant is also well known in the beginning of the Iron Age, not only in the late Bronze. Speaking about the late Bronze, we are in the 14th, 13th centuries BC, in the Iron One, in the following period, 12th or 11th centuries BC. There's this phenomenon of the collapse of the civilizations of the Bronze Age, and the result was movement of groups from the Aegean basin and beyond, even from the Eastern Mediterranean, into places in the Levant. This is, as you can see on the left-hand side of this picture, well documented in ancient texts, both from Egypt and from the commercial city harbor of Ugarit on the Syrian coast in western Syria. So for this, we have plenty of evidence, archaeological and textual, that comes from both regions, the Aegean on one side and the Levant on the other. Now the question, of course, was what exactly was it that was shipped? What was on the move between the Aegean and the Levant and back in the late Bronze and Iron One? And I'm asking this because there were several researchers about 10 years ago or 15 years ago that suggested that in fact very few people moved from one place to the other, and most of the items that were moved were commodities in the shape of pottery vessels, the content of the vessels, of course, and so on. So the question was what kind of mobility we can speak about between the two regions in the late Bronze and the Iron Age one. And as you know better than me, animals can be a very good proxy for understanding mobility of people. And this is why we turn to animal DNA. And we decided to start working with pigs for the simple reason that of the data from archaeological excavations in Israel. Yora Horowitz, sitting here, was responsible for part of this. We, in the last 20-30 years, noticed that pigs do not come in the same proportion in the faunal assemblages in late Bronze and Iron Age assemblages in this country and the regions around us. That is to say that in certain area in the southern coastal plain, ancient Philistia, where, according to later texts, biblical and others, the Philistines, one of the sea people, settled possibly in the early phase of the Iron Age. Percentage of pigs was very high, whereas in other parts of the country, both in the late Bronze Age and in the Iron One, the percentages were minimal. I am excavating at the site of Megiddo, both in the Iron Age and also in the late Bronze. The percentages of bones, the percentage was minimal. So the following question was, what was the reason for the exceptional peak proportion in Philistia, specifically in this area, only in the southern coastal plain of Israel, where the numbers get to 18, 20 and more % of the assemblage. And the question also was, did they originate the people in pork-consuming societies and develop pig culture in the Levant using the local breed, or whether they brought pigs with them? And if the latter is the answer, the second is the answer, so then the next question would be, did they do this for identity reasons, one possibility, or for practical reasons, such as, for instance, to keep the ships clean, if you wish, or for other reasons which are obscure from us? And in order to answer these questions, we turn to two sites especially, in cooperation of colleagues from Heidelberg, Joseph Maran and Philip Stockhammer, who are excavating at the celebrated site of Tiris. I think Johannes Krause is connected to this project. So the sites where we took the samples from are Tiris in Greece, which is one of the most important sites for the palatial period in the Mycenaean world, specifically so for the 13th and 12th, beginning of the 12th centuries BC, which means exactly the period that we wanted to take a look at. And the site on the right-hand side, the site of Megiddo, and a very important place in the Levant, one of the most important sites for the continuity of Bronze and Iron Age cultures in this region. And this was the beginning of the study.
Okay, good morning. So for the genetic point of view, there is another reason, important reason why we chose to work in pigs. As you heard from the previous talk, mitochondrial studies showed that there is a strong phylogeographic structure along the entire distribution range of pigs. And here you can see the distribution range of wild boar, and it covers large parts of Eurasia. And each color represents a clade or clade. And for our study, it was really important for us to be able to distinguish between the European clade, where you can find samples from all across Europe except for parts of Italy, and for the Near Eastern clades, where you can find samples from Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and even one sample from Egypt. Now, what we did was to collect samples from Turin, 23 samples, all came from the late bronze, and 44 samples from Megiddo, which the date range between the Bronze and the Iron Age. And we also collected ancient samples from Israel, from across Israel, with ranging dates from the Neolithic to the Crusaders. We did that because we wanted to be able to compare our results and to follow after changes through time. We also sampled modern wild boars from Israel, because in the gene bank there was only one DNA sequence from Israel, and we wanted more to be able to compare. And there was quite a lot of data on modern wild boars from Greece. Now, we worked on part of the mitochondrial DNA, the control region. And I know that this is a traditional way, and it's not as glamour as working with the next generation sequencing, but we had to start somewhere. So we started with a normal traditional PCR. Obviously, the fragment that we worked for, the ancient samples, was much smaller. But previous studies have shown that it was enough to be able to distinguish whether the sample is coming from Europe or whether it has a Near Eastern signature. Now, for the results and first I want to show you the results from the modern Israeli wild boar. And now, this is the phylogenetic tree that consists of modern wild boars and domestic pigs from across Eurasia. In the squares, you can see the European haplotype in the European clade in red and the Near Eastern clades. And we sampled pigs from different habitats across Israel, the coastal, the mountain, and even one relic population from the desert over a period of 60 years. So some of the samples were fresh, some of the samples came from museum. And all of the 25 modern samples all carry European haplotypes. And moreover, 19 has the same DNA sequence. So the genetic diversity is very low. And you need to remember that pigs, wild boars, from around us, from Turkey, from Iran, from Syria, Iraq, they're all falling here. So these results, made us think, what's going on over here? Now, for the results for the ancient Israeli samples. So I've extracted 177 samples, and 34 yielded DNA. The success ratio is around 19, and maybe some of you will think that this is quite low, but I was really happy that I had something. We're here in Israel, and the weather is against us, so I was really happy. You can see here in the graph the number of samples on the y-axis and the different periods on the x-axis, and we start from the Middle Bronze Age. So although I really wanted that the Chalcolithic and the Neolithic samples to work, they didn't, and yeah, preservation is a really big issue in this region. And the color here, the colors represent the different haplotypes. Again, red is Europe haplotypes, and the yellow and the turquoise is Near Eastern haplotypes. And what we can see is that we used to have here in Israel a Near Eastern haplotypes. We don't have them anymore now. And around the Iron Age 2, around 900 BC, over here, the European haplotypes become predominant. And slowly, with time, they just take over the signal, the mitochondrial signal. The peak that we see in the Iron Age, we may relate it to the Philistines that brought pigs with them, but we're not entirely sure. And what is, I think, is obvious that pigs were brought to this region again and again, even in later periods, Hellenistics, the Roman, Crusaders. So, and this probably helped to this turnover. We have one sample from the Middle Bronze that carry European haplotype. Unfortunately, we tried to radiocarbon date this sample, but there was insufficient collagen inside. So we are not entirely sure about the age, but it can be European haplotype because it's coming from a port city of Ashkelon. Another way to show the same results, but here you can see the relationship between the haplotypes and the frequencies. This is a three-dimensional parsimony network, and it consists only of a short fragment. And the top layer is the modern Eurasia pigs, which is very much consistent with the phylogenetic tree. And the three other layers are coming from the ancient Israeli pigs. And again, you can see, and the vertical lines, they connect the same haplotypes through the different periods. And in Israel, we can find haplotypes over here, the Near Eastern ones, that we can still find today in the region, but not in Israel. And the haplotype, the most popular haplotypes that we found in Israel, the European one, is also very popular today in Europe. Now, for Greece, the results for Greece. So, unfortunately, from Greece, we don't have other periods to compare the results to, but this is something that we are working on it now. And if you look at the modern wild boars, so there is quite a lot of data, almost 200 samples, all carry European haplotypes, while 7 samples from Tyrian from the late bronze, here we can find European haplotypes, but also we can see that there is Near Eastern haplotypes as well. And moreover, there is one haplotype, which is Y2. We didn't find it in Israel. And we can find it in Anatolia at the same time, really. So maybe this is a connection between Anatolia and Greece. It can be. Now, according to Philip Stockhammer, one of the excavators of Tyrian, the samples are coming from a feast context. So it may relate that people are bringing food to the feast, whether they are bringing only the meat or bringing the actual animal. this is still an open question. So just to combine the result together, and together with some published data from Anatolia, and looking through time. So first of all, looking from the Neolithic to the early Bronze, and I just squeeze the whole periods into one because we don't have any DNA results from this region. Hopefully, maybe when we will try the Petrus bone, maybe the results will be better. So, but we do have quite a lot of samples from Anatolia, and they all carry Near Eastern haplotypes. And this is important to us. Part of them are wild boars, especially the ones that are coming from the Neolithic. And this is important because this is now, we know what was the situation before people started to move pigs around. So we know that the local signature was Near Eastern. Then we switch to the Middle Bronze. And this is very amusing because we have one undated sample that carry European haplotype. And also in the study, the authors from the study in Anatolia also had one European sample that they couldn't date it. So there is a question mark on that. And then we go to the late Bronze, the time when the crisis begin and empire collapsed and people are starting to move. In Israel, we see only Near Eastern haplotypes. But we see 3 samples in Anatolia that carry European haplotype. And in Greece and in Turin, we can see European and Near Eastern haplotypes. You can see the Y2 that is connected between Greece and Anatolia. So this is implying some sort of a connection. We don't know, but there is something. The reason that we don't have European haplotype here is maybe because the sampling size is too small. All of the samples that I've tried to extract from Finkelstein site didn't work, so we don't actually know. Or maybe this is a matter of time. Maybe because this is more south of the south, maybe it takes time until the signal comes here. I don't know. In the Iron Age, the European haplotype is becoming much more dominant here and in Anatolia. And when we go with time, we can see that in archaeological sites, European haplotype is very, very dominant. And looking at all of these time slices, there is some sort of independent replication between our region and Anatolia, and this is really nice, until we reach to the present. So here we switch again to talk about the wild boar, and while we can find in Anatolia Near Eastern haplotypes, we can't find it here in Israel. And there is a complete turnover in the population, and now we are analyzing some SNP data in order to test what really happened, whether there is we are talking about European domestic pigs that just escaped, went feral, and maybe they pushed away the local Near Eastern pigs, or maybe they hybridized with them. But in either cases, the thing is that the genetic diversity is very low. So probably some bottleneck event or events happened through the way. And one of them is documented, and it happened in the early 1940s, where they were hunted and they were on the verge of extinction. And then Israel was established, and there was a law to protect the nature, and it was banned to hunt pigs, so the population stable, and now we can find them all across Israel again. So just to sum up things, so during the late Bronze Age, domestic pigs from Israel were genetically identical to modern and ancient Near Eastern pigs. Pigs possessing European signature became dominant in the region, starting in the early phase of Iron Age 2. The complete mitochondrial turnover has taken place in Israeli wild boars. In the late Bronze Age, there are Near Eastern pigs in the south of Greece and European pigs in Asia Minor, but not in the Levant. But in the Iron Age, significant number of European pigs in both regions. So we've started with the archaeological question, and just to sum up the archaeological point of view, I will ask Israel to come.
One last question that needs to be asked, I think. It is very clear, as you have just seen, that European pigs arrived in the Levant, maybe in the beginning of the second millennium, but definitely starting in the Iron Age. In the late Bronze Age, we still see the local Near Eastern pigs. Now, there is a chronological problem here. We cannot say, of course, that the pigs were brought solely by Philistines or the sea people, because there's always the possibility of late Bronze that people in the late Bronze brought pigs from the Aegean because of the strong connections between the two regions at that time. In any event, we have a chronological problem here, because the pigs appeared in the Iron Age in around 900 BC, in the beginning of what we archaeologists call Iron Age 2A. Whereas we are describing here processes, historical processes that took place before, in the 13th century BC or in the 12th century BC. So there is a gap. How to explain this gap? Two possibilities, as I am indicating here. One possibility is that we simply do not have enough samples for the time being. Please remember that we are dealing with 27 samples from all over Israel, and we need more samples. And of course, we need to acknowledge that for the time being, we don't have samples, or we don't have enough samples from the southern coastal plain, the area where the later Philistines settled in the Iron Age. The second possibility is simply, I think I have a map somewhere here. No, the map disappeared, never mind. The second possibility is that is the distance. There is a distance of 150 kilometers. Theoretically speaking, it can be influential between the southern coastal plain and the Jezreel Valley, where we have the first European pigs in the Iron Age, and there simply could have been some sort of a slow development of expansion of pig culture from that area in the south to other parts of the country. Let me just finish by saying that we are now in the same project. We are looking now at other animals, and we hope to be able to describe results for cows in the near future.
Thank you very much. So, are there any questions?
This archaeology, do you have any idea why pig is so different than, let's say, cow and religious type? Why they oppose so much the pig? I understand that probably the Christian brought them, and the local people oppose that, and so we choose pig as a symbol, I guess. But is that what you think?
Then you're asking a question which is completely different. It has to be to get the taboo on pigs. We published an article on this recently, but it has nothing to do with DNA. It has to do with the distribution of pig bones. The conventional wisdom before was that the pigs were some sort of a marker of identity, we and they situation, which means that we really see, we thought that we could see in the highlands the avoidance of consumption of pigs starting in the beginning of the Iron Age. However, later archaeological investigations show that we are some sort of somewhere in a certain way wrong, because there were not big numbers of pigs even in the late Bronze Age in the lowlands of the country. And as we see things today, there is another piece of evidence which is really important, that we see distinction between pig consumption in Judah and Israel in the Iron Age. In other words, there is a complete avoidance of pork consumption in the south, whereas in the lowlands of the northern kingdom of Israel, there is strong evidence for pork consumption in a certain period of the Iron Age. So today, we see the difference and also the development of the taboo on the background of historical processes and cultural differences within the country in the Iron Age.
Any further questions? If not, we are perfect in time, so we can close the first part and we meet again at 12.